Thank you very much. That was a nice brief introduction. It's embarrassing when people list all this stuff. So I also want to acknowledge that I'm a guest here on Mi'kmaq and Maliseet territory. I pay my respect to the elders, past and present, the knowledge keepers as well. And I bring greetings from Treaty 4 area. That's where I'm from, which is home of the Nehewak, that's the Cree people, the Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota peoples, and the Métis, my people. Thank you, Jimmy Kelly, for the invitation and the wonderful hospitality on your behalf and on the university. It's been very difficult deciding what to present to you, and so I sent about 4 or 5 topics to Jemmy, and she picked this one. And reading through it again, so this paper is about 4 or 5 years old. It was in the midst of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I had really mixed feelings about it, about the commission. I had gone to, actually by the time I first wrote this paper, I hadn't been to any TRC events. Since then, I went to 3 major ones. I got caught up in this shirt grant and decided to do some curation and other writing. So what I'm going to read to you now is collage in a way. I think there's a strand of things that hold it all together, but I've written much more extensively on each of the many ideas here. So it's kind of a barrage. I think it's written in pretty plain language, but it is a bit of a barrage. And so if there's anything you're interested, I'd love to follow up. Or if you're curious, I can send you more recent and fulsome text. I'm not strictly an academic writer. I have that temperament of an intellectual, I guess you'd say it, or an academic, but I can't stand doing the responsible thing, which is doing all the readings in the area and then presenting the findings and then offering my 2 paragraphs of insight. Instead, what I do is I talk to an awful lot of people. I think deeply on things. I follow a more hermeneutic approach. And I think about what people might be thinking, and then I go and ask them, see if it's true. So for this paper, I talked to Alex Janvier, Adrian Stimson, student survivors that I know, just all sorts of people. So I feel much of what I'm saying is true. But might only be true of my experience and of the prairies and the West Coast and a bit of Ontario and Australia, and maybe not true for here. So I apologize if they don't ring true. It's a bit of a barrage, as I say. So at the end, I'm actually going to have a bit of uplift. I'm reading from one of the articles from Border Crossings, which was written for a much more general audience. And since there's a lot of art-type students here, I think it'll give you some hope. And if you're non-Indigenous, it'll give you something to identify with. Otherwise, you're probably going to feel shitty and guilty. But maybe not, right? So it's important for us to situate our knowledge, and so I'm a Métis person. I descend from Eleanor and Laurent Garneau, and Jim Brady's my uncle, who was a socialist activist and really pretty important figure on the prairies. My great-great-grandfather Laurent was almost hung during the Louis Riel resistance, and that's why there's a lot of nooses in my paintings. I'm not going to show many of my own paintings, maybe 1 or 2. And so that idea of being haunted by the specter of silence in a very literal way is of interest to me. And Métis people, for the most part, are a little bit more privileged than Indigenous people, because many of us, there's such a spectrum, right? But most of us have more European looks, and so therefore are more privileged. When we go to university, you get far less resistance until you start talking about Indigenous issues, and then it's trouble. So anyways, those are my family. So I'm from Alberta originally, Edmonton. So I grew up knowing there's a Garneau district there. I knew my heritage, knew my history, but the word Métis didn't cross my lips till I was about 18 years old. And I was showing in an art gallery. I was making little sculptures of men on the street and showing in a gallery, and a reporter comes in, starts talking to me and says, well, you're Métis. What? I had no idea what she was referring to. She said, well, you're a descendant of Laurent Garneau, aren't you? Yeah. Well, he's Métis. There's a plaque to Garneau, there's all this stuff written, but Métis is never mentioned, or his Indigenous heritage is never mentioned. Since reading, my dad was an amateur historian, and then I got the full story when I was late, like 18. But I really didn't identify as Métis until maybe 5-10 years after that. And partially that was due to a lot of culture wars that were happening in Alberta, Canada, and Métis and Indigenous people approached me and said that, you speak good, you talk. And so I was quiet for about 10 years, and then I've been talking ever since. So this is one of my paintings. So now I'm going to read, and I know it's very dull, but I really need to be concentrating my ideas, and I hate to misspeak, but I will open questions at the end for anybody who's interested, and I can expound at length. So the oil painting, Aboriginal Curatorial Collective Meeting, is my attempt to picture an event without betraying its content. It's composed like a comic book page, but the panels only show empty speech bubbles. The bubbles' varying flesh tones are meant to stand in for specific Indigenous persons. The painting reminds me of the relationship, exchanges, and affect of a particular moment. Most importantly, it allows me to show what happened without giving anything away. But tonight, I would like to say a little about the meeting. So one of the reasons why I'm reading this paper is it just got published in a book on Indigenous art, possible answers to truth and reconciliation, as far as I like to think of it as fact and conciliation. During an Aboriginal Curatorial Collective Symposium at the National Gallery in Ottawa in 2011, a non-Indigenous academic championed the art of an Indian residential school survivor, Mohawk artist R.G. Miller Lahakas. Some of the audience were uncomfortable from the start. Was it because the presenter was white and the artist absent? Perhaps, or it could be that the crowd was sensitive to his lack of sensitivity. The talk peaked with a comparison of the effects of Indian residential schools with flesh-eating disease, complete with photographs. It was offensive, particularly to the survivors present. Oblivious and confused, the man was ushered from the building. The event gathered Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal folks, but following this incident, a group of Indigenous people removed themselves to a separate room to comfort a senior artist and survivor and to figure out what happened and should happen next. Later, the main room was cleansed with song and smudge, and the symposium resumed. There's no need to detail this incident further. It is only one example used to hint at the challenge of reconciliation in the curatorial and academic realm. So one lesson I got from this. While decolonization and indigenization is a collective work, it sometimes requires occasions of separation, moments where Indigenous people take time and space to work things out among themselves, and parallel moments when allies ought to do the same thing. A second lesson, the professor in question, Neil Keating, an American, is not a curator, but an anthropologist who, perhaps out of a sense of justice, felt the need to play the part of a curator. Presumably, he determined that his need and interest, his compassion, was enough to qualify him to stride into this complex discourse. That he played a curator before an international gathering of Indigenous curators was audacious and symptomatic of a larger concern about white colonial professional privilege. The colonial attitude is characterized not only by scopophilia, a drive to look, but also by an urge to penetrate, to traverse, to know, to translate, to own, and exploit. The attitude assumes that everything should be accessible to those with the means and will to access them, or the compassion. Everything is ultimately comprehensible, a potential commodity, a resource, or salvage. The academic branch of this enterprise collects and analyzes the experiences and things of others, transforms story into text and objects in relation into artifacts to be cataloged and stored or displayed. The primary sites of Indigenous resistance, then, are not the rare open battles between the colonized and the dominant, but the everyday active refusals of complete engagement with agents of exploitation and assimilation. This includes speaking with one's own way, refusing translation and full explanations, refusing to be a native informant. I'm interested in Indigenous refusal, particularly why many Indian residential school survivors do not participate in Canada's Truth and Reconciliation journey, and how this non-compliance signals the need for forms of creative representations outside of the current reconciliation narrative. I will outline how Indigenous resistance to the reconciliatory gaze can inform the development of sovereign display territories, but this essay also looks to possibilities other than separatism, to the development of non-colonial, Indigenous, non-Indigenous curatorial projects, academic and artistic collaborations beyond the project currently known as Reconciliation. I should say this paper was pretty successful in getting my mission down, in that it was cited in the TRC final report a couple of times, but also where I'm going with this is the difference between conciliation and reconciliation. That has been recognized by, you'll see in brackets and conciliation in Canada Council grants, and also an upcoming event at the Banff Centre, which brings together all kinds of reconciliation people. And all of that was based on this paper, so I'm kind of proud I should mention that. So the sanctioned performance of reconciliation is foundationally distorted. Testimony produced for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'll just say TRC after this, is constrained by non-Indigenous narratives of closure, by Western religious ideology, by an emphasis on individuals over communities, by the public display of victims and not perpetrators, and by the degrading and corrupting influence of cash for testimony. As a result, not all stories are welcome in these official sites, and not everyone is interested in engaging this often humiliating form of theater. If artistic and curatorial practices that are critical of this structure, or that emerge out of experiences and ways of knowing and being that cannot be accommodated or contained within the TRCs or traditional academic display mechanisms, are to find room for expression, those spaces must be articulated outside of an exploitation and assimilationist project. This is Terence Sewell's work. A goal of non-colonial, so I'm thinking about non-colonial rather than decolonization. A goal of non-colonial curatorial and art practice is to make room for the production and reception of Indigenous experience and expression apart from the dominant discourse. Some of this work seeks to recover and perpetuate pre-contact culture. Some is reactive, directly challenging colonization and racism. Other practices struggle to describe or perform new ways of being that are cognizant that a return to pre-contact conditions is impossible, and that total assimilation to the dominant ideology, which would be cultural genocide, is unacceptable. Oops. And more recently, there are performative dialogues, for instance, among First Nations artists and non-Caucasian Canadians, that shift emphasis from themes of oppression and resistance to the production of generous moments of empathy and agreement beyond conventional native white settler binaries. In each case, the goal is to resist and transform colonial ideology and behavior. This change is not for the Indigenous alone. In environments of perpetual conciliation, non-Indigenous people struggle with their inherited privilege, also unlearn the colonial attitude, and work towards non-colonial practices. I don't know if you know Bell Hooks, a reader, but she's really great still. In Altars of Sacrifice, Remembering Basquiat, my all-time favorite art history essay, just read the first 2 pages, that's all you need to know. Bell Hooks explains that the young African-American artist Jean-Michel Basquiat's paintings are like a wall, in quotation, a wall between him and the established art world, close quotes. His works are, she describes, a barrier, quotes, designed to be a closed door, and like a secret chamber that can only be opened and entered by those who can decipher hidden codes, close quote. His art is closed to what she calls the Eurocentric gaze, and is only fully available to those who share like experiences with the work's creator. The codes are not just signifiers that can be converted into denotative signs by a competent reader, though that's an important aspect. They also have empathetic undertones in tune with the felt relationships and wordless understanding shared by members of a culture. So this is weird. So you might read that for a minute. I've recently written a lot more about this incredible object. So every culture circulates around a set of objects and spaces that are beyond property and trade. They are the national treasures, sacred sites and texts, symbols and meanings that are a community's gravitational center. The objects and their protection define the culture, hold its many parts in orbit. The colonial attitude, the state of mind required to assume control over the space, bodies, objects, and trade of others, begins by refusing the living relational value of these entities. This is done in one of two ways. Either the colonist refuses the sacred character of the object or site because it derives from a metaphysical system that it rejects in favor of its own cosmology, Christian attitude or scientific attitude, or in a recent and more sensitive version, materialist scholars reckon the semiotic value of sacred objects, but do not experience their symbolic value. That is, they recognize the object's value for believers, but not for themselves. Because of their objectivist creed and position as outsiders, materialist scholars do not know the essential sacred qualities of these entities from within the believer's lived experience. As a result, you can read about Aboriginal art by non-Indigenous writers and receive anthropological insights, learn about the history, sociology, economics, political meanings, and occasionally the aesthetics of these works. But it is rare for such texts to include, for example, narratives about how one feels with these things. How, as Bell Hooks says, one was, quote, moved, touched, taken to another place, momentarily born again, close quotes. These accounts are either not included because they are not experienced, or more likely excluded because such confessions lie outside of the objectivist discourse of these disciplined texts. Such writings keep the first person, the author, at a distance from the First Nations artwork. Hooks argues that if critics, in her Basquiat example, are, quotes, unmoved, they are unable to speak meaningfully about the work. So this is the opposite of Kant. Instead of being an objective viewer, you are a subjective receiver. And unless you can get subjective with these objects, you can't see them. The meanings she alludes to include these felt values, communal affects, and metaphysical knowings that lie beyond textuality. They are the epistemologies and methodologies that often run contrary and therefore threaten the dominant order. If the metaphysical qualities of these things are not recognized as essential properties, as facts, then they suddenly become available for appropriation. So this is key. You have to, if you're an appropriationist or a materialist colonizer, you have to say that these aren't sacred objects, and then you can take them. So in the past, less so now, desacralized the medicine, bundle, mask, song, story, the land, especially the land, became mere real things that have ascertainable market value or academic worth. Through the alchemy of colonial imagination, sacred and cultural objects are transmogrified into commodities, melted for their gold value or collected for their artifact or art value. Now I need to define my terms. What do we mean by art in this context? By art, I mean the recent, modernist, Western sense of objects having universal and therefore no longer local value. Creations that are expressions of humans and therefore belong to all of humankind, though only collected and administered by those who are properly trained in the correct humanist tradition. The desire of the colonists is not just directed at appropriating these material things, but to displacing their local symbolic value. This decontextualization erodes the culture by removing the gravitational center. The same operation happens when Indigenous lands are converted by colonists from sacred and eternal relationships with the people into property separable from the people. I want to give you a cool example of a response. In response to voracious traders, and I've seen this in collections in New Zealand too, I haven't seen it in Australia yet, but lots of shelves of this kind of stuff in New Zealand. That's really, really neat. So in response to voracious traders, Indigenous cultures have since contacts devised ingenious ways to protect their sacred things from appropriation through the use of screen objects. I've stolen the idea of screen objects from Freudian psychoanalysis, and Freud talks about screen memories. Screen memories are seemingly insignificant and incomplete memories that both suggest and conceal meaningful but repressed content. In order to satiate settler cravings for their sacred objects, Maori, Haida, all Indigenous people produced and continue to produce trade goods. Screen objects resemble the sacred things they imitate, but do not include their animation. These sculptures, masks, and garments have the patina of the originals, but none of the meaning, ritual, or context. They are cultural artifacts, reasonable facsimiles designed for others and to give nothing essential away. The hope is that the colonizers might settle for the appearance and leave the essential undisturbed. My favorite example comes from the Haida who carved argillite to look like authentic ceremony pipes. But you'd get these pipes and the hole is drilled into the bowl and the stem, but they don't meet, so you can't smoke them. So visitors bought signifiers of Haida culture, but could not enjoy full use. Aboriginal curatorial collective meaning is part of a series of paintings that visualize Indigenous intellectual spaces that exist apart from a non-Indigenous gaze and interlocution. The idea is to signal to non-Indigenous spectators the fact that intellectual activity is occurring without their knowledge. That is, without their knowledge in the sense of without their being aware, and without their knowledge in the sense of intellectual activities based on native rather than Western epistemologies. I think of these as irreconcilable spaces of Aboriginality. Irreconcilable spaces of Aboriginality are gatherings, ceremony, nehewak, that is Cree-only discussions, kitchen table conversations, email exchanges, etc., in which Blackfootness, Métis-ness, and so on are performed without settler attendance. It is not a show for others, but a site where people simply are for and with each other without the sense that they're being witnessed. When Indigenous folks, anyone really, know they are being surveyed by non-members by the nature of their ways of being and becoming alters, whether the onlookers are conscious agents of colonization or not, their shaping gaze can trigger, inhibit, or be a confirmation to settler expectations. I just want to add, I was at a gathering of primarily Indigenous people in the Yukon just before coming here. And I coined this phrase that got a lot of laughs, the elder gaze, because we'd be there, have these concentric circles of, I don't know, more than 100 people, mostly Indigenous, and the elders were in the center, and when we'd say something outrageous, they'd give us the side look. And that shaped us as much. And when I took over, I was in charge of the youth panel, and I put the youth in the center, and I told them to ignore the sidelong looks. They had to speak for themselves. That got the sidelong look too. So it's anybody being seen who aren't part of that group. So this is not to imply that in these spaces our identities are suddenly resolved and constant. These are sites of epistemological debate. In the exchange of stories, gestures, touches, thoughts, tears, and laughter, the nature of, say, Métis-ness is subtly tested, reconsidered, provisionally confirmed, or gently reconfigured. But these negotiations are performed in relation to like others. This is a delicate matter. Non-Indigenous friends, colleagues, and collaborators who have long worked to raise awareness, to create opportunities to rethink art and exhibitions, the Academy, and the idea of Canada, and are themselves otherwise, are essential to these struggles. They are frontrunners who risk a great deal to be allies and work towards justice and fundamental change. However, allies know that the lived complexity of Aboriginality exists beyond their presence as surely as the inhabitation of white privilege or Koreanness or Swedish immigrantness is incompletely available to Native people. That said, these boundaries are not absolute but a matter of degree. Surely a second-generation Canadian of Korean descent who lives in Nunavut and speaks fluent Inuktitut, for example, can be said to participate in Inuit life in a more engaged way than the catch-all word settler or non-Indigenous imposes. The purpose of anti-racist work in Canada is for settlers to learn more about their hosts and hosts to learn more about their guests, to move through proximity, listening, empathy, cooperative inquiry, and action to a state of racial confusion. Settlers who, I like that, I gotta read it again, sorry. A purpose of anti-racist work in Canada is for settlers to learn more about their hosts, Indigenous people, and hosts to know more about their guests, to move through proximity, listening, empathy, cooperative inquiry, and action to a state of racial confusion. Settlers who become unsettled, who are aware of their inheritance and implication in the colonial matrix, who comprehend their unearned privilege and seek ways past racism, eventually are settlers no longer. It's not that these folks have gone native, though intercultural adoption and honorary citizenship in traditional possibilities. They do become respectful guests, which in turn allows Indigenous people to be graceful hosts. Many residential school survivors will not tell their stories to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Some have not and never will speak of such things, even within the safety of autonomous Indigenous spaces. As Alex Janvier writes on the back of his painting, Blood Tears, many, many died of broken bodies. Many, many died of twisted, conflicting mental difference. Most died with broken spirit. Some lived to tell about it. The rest permanently live in fear. The rest will take their silence to the graves, as many have to this day. I talked to Alex and others and said that, I didn't want to do this work, and these two people, Alex and Adrian Stimson and others, said, well, if not you, who? Who's equipped to do this? I still am not equipped, but you got to give it a shot. I'm not as traumatized by any stretch as they are. For some, the trauma visited upon their young minds and bodies are a private matter, or rather these profound dislocations and violations created an impenetrable private space, a twisted, conflicting mental difference. It made of their minds an asocial space of shame and despair, a disassociation seemingly beyond both Indigenous and dominant culture community. For others, hints of these experiences are shared in irreconcilable moments, that is, not as confessions designed to be reconciled in the sense of being smoothed over or brought into public agreement. They are open wounds shared with intimates for complex and inconclusive reasons. They are not for general consumption. They are not subjects of analysis. Their listeners are not only witnesses, but are often intergenerational co-survivors of Indian residential schools and other forms of aggressive assimilation. All this lies far from the play of representation circulated in the theater of national reconciliation. Among the subjects shared in irreconcilable spaces of Aboriginality are aspects of the Indian residential school legacy that are discouraged from disclosure in TRC events. So for instance, Aboriginal people in those places weren't allowed to express rage. They weren't able to express the refusal to forgive. They were absolutely restricted from naming names. The details of intergenerational effects were not allowed to speak, or rarely. I did hear a few people speak. The use of Indigenous people in the schools. So Indigenous people are often employed to subject their own kind to violence. That wasn't discussed. The deformation of masculinity there, talking about what happened to the payout money and how it distorted individuals, families, and communities, and so on. None of this stuff was allowed in those spaces. It did trickle in now and then, but it was not sanctioned. The extraordinary people who do share their Indian residential school experiences with Canadians as part of the TRC sessions do so for many reasons. To speak the truth, to witness, to heal, and I don't want to offend those folks, but I do want to discuss a very specific aspect of the display mechanisms they're caught up in. So conciliation is the action of bringing into harmony. It is an extrajudicial process that is a conversion of a state of hostility or distrust, the promotion of goodwill by kind and considerate measures, and peaceable or friendly union. The word calls to mind the meeting of two previously separate parties into an amicable process. Reconciliation is a seeming synonym, but it's very different. Reconciliation refers to the repair of a previously existing harmonious relationship. In the present situation, this word choice imposes the fiction that equanimity was the status quo between Indigenous people in Canada. It is true that for many generations after contact, some Indigenous peoples had reasonably equal and peaceful relationships with some Europeans as individuals rather than nations. The serious troubles began when the visitors decided to become settlers, when traders were replaced by ever-increasing waves of colonists, when invading nations decided they would rather own the well than just share the water. This reached a crescendo when the territories became Rupert's Land and then Canada without negotiations or fair negotiations with original inhabitants. The problem with the choice of the word reconciliation over conciliation is that it creates a false understanding of our past and constricts our collective sense of the future. The word suggests that there was a time of general conciliation between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada, and that this peace was tragically disrupted by the Indian residential schools, which will be painfully restored through the current process of reconciliation. The imagined conciliation before reconciliation probably does not refer to the moments of cooperation scattered here and there over several centuries after contact, but probably to the post-Confederation numbered treaties between the Crown and many First Nations. However, while extensive, these agreements do not include everyone. It doesn't include most of British Columbia, and Quebec are not covered by treaty, and the Métis are not treaty people. Treaties are very important, but their uneven nature and their continuous violation trouble any notion of a prior universal resolution between Indigenous people and Canada. The constant repetition of the word reconciliation creates a screen for the content conciliation. It expresses a present wish that there truly was a past comprehensive settlement in order that the future can be bearable. Settlement was not an agreement between First Nations and Canada. It was not the treaties and was not conciliatory, but it was universal, and it was the imposition in 1876 of the Indian Act. The first line of the TRC website mandate page reads, I don't know if it's still up this way, but it was in 2011, 2012. There is an emerging and compelling desire to put the events of the past behind us so we can work towards a stronger and healthier future. Whose desire is this? If it is a colonial desire, then reconciliation is a continuation of the settlement narrative. The word conjures images of halcyon moments of conciliation before things went wrong as the site of national origin. It pictures the Indian residential school era as an unfortunate deviation rather than just another aspect of the ongoing colonial struggle to contain and control Aboriginal people, territories, and resources. The present colonial desire is to put the events of the past behind us and reconcile Aboriginal people within this narrative. The reconciliation narrative anesthetizes knowledge of pre-contact Aboriginal sovereignty and creates in settler minds the sense that Indigenous people are Canadians like them, that they came into being with Canada, that they are simply a minority interest group rather than a pre-existing host and partners who make Canada possible. I gave a similar talk in actually, it wasn't a red talk, it was a talk in Ontario a while back, and was shocked, or people were shocked when they were sort of asking, what do Indigenous people want? And I said, well, I know a lot do not consider themselves Canadian, right? They're occupied people. So especially from the point of view of the Indigenous leaders who signed them in the good faith, treaties were nation-to-nation conciliations. Treaties recognized pre-existing and ongoing sovereignty of conciliating parties. Oops, I'm behind there, sorry. This understanding is eloquently figured in the two-row treaty wampum belts. Two boats, in this case a British ship and an Iroquois canoe, go down the river of life together but don't touch. Two communities live parallel with each other, trade but do not violate each other's space and custom. Two states, acting as states, can establish a neutral space of negotiation between their communities in which general conciliation is established as a living agreement, a relationship that does not compromise each other's core spaces. Conciliation is not the erasure of difference or sovereignty. Conciliation is not assimilation. However, because treaties were not entered into in good faith by the colonizers, but were conceived as non-violent means to subdue Indigenous people in order to occupy their land, we ought to consider their conceptual value as the we ought to reconsider the conceptual value as the firm or only basis for present relations. The treaties are historical facts, but honoring them requires a continuous relationship which includes interpreting, reinterpreting, and renegotiation. This is perpetual conciliation. As someone raised Catholic, my uncle is a bishop, my aunt is a nun working in inner city Edmonton, and my stepfather was a former Jesuit priest, and my mom even trained to be a nun for a little while in New Brunswick before getting the boot. I cannot help but notice a religious nuance in the choice of the word reconciliation rather than conciliation in Canada's truth and reconciliation journey. Whether the choice of this word is an accidental inheritance from South Africa, for instance, in South America, or not, it is ironic, if not sinister, that the survivors of religious residential schools, especially Catholic ones, are asked to participate in a ritual that so closely resembles that which abused them. Reconciliation is a sacrament of the Catholic Church. How many Catholics here? Or former lapse? None? One. Okay, you might understand what I'm saying. So reconciliation is a sacrament of the Catholic Church. It follows confession, penance. Reconciliation is the reunion of a person to a church. According to the Vatican, those who approach the sacrament of penance obtain pardon from God's mercy for the offense committed against him, and are at the same time reconciled with the church, which they have wounded by their sins, and which by charity, by example, and by prayer labors for their conversion. So that text was found in the Sacraments of Healing section of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So reconciliation assumes that the parties were once in harmony through the contracts of baptism, confirmation, and communion, and only through reconciliation can proper stasis be restored. Beyond the pale of reconciliation is the possibility that the church could be wrong. Individuals are faulty and in need of reformation, never the church. The church is a static archetype. People are imperfect beings who variously move toward or away from that perfect Platonic universal. This imaginary informs the secular version of Canada's truth and reconciliation journey. The relationship is individual to state, rather than nation to nations or person to person negotiations of conciliation or treaty models. The system requires individual accounts, confessions, and healing narratives, forgiveness. It prefers to lay blame on the individuals, mostly dead and certainly absent members, and even when it does willingly present them for public confession and atonement. While it acknowledges that abuses were the result of past systematic policy, Canada does not do anything that would risk the integrity of current dominant structures. Because the system is premised on assimilation, it is cautious about recognizing that it is in perpetual relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and so it imposes a time limit on healing. It pays off individuals rather than recognize that harms are done not only to persons, but collective and intergenerational wholes. The imagined end of this restoration project is Canada's truth and reconciliation. Truths are told, the destroyed are mourned, the broken repaired, individual natives reconciled with Canada, order restored, and the national identity endures. You can imagine that those removed from their culture, language, and spiritual traditions and who were indoctrinated by religious Indian residential schools would slide rather easily into the similar confessional narratives of a truth and reconciliation system. And those who retained or regained their cultural and spiritual practices are likely to be suspicious of the homology and resist. To be fair, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and especially the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, has developed into a complex and responsive organism that has permitted multiple anti-colonial possibilities for as long as the government entertains them. Both organizations have established numerous sites apart from state monitoring, and the public airing of the outlines of these facts, the government apology, and the work of the Commission have encouraged many to discuss things they might not have otherwise. Questions remain, however. How do we prevent reconciliation from being primarily a spectacle of individual pain for settler consumption and Aboriginal shame? How are we to design future sites of reconciliation into sites of conciliation? How are artists and curators to contribute to the conciliation process? I'm a longtime Alex Janvier fan, but my interest was primarily formal. I love his designs and appreciate his ability to create a unique synthesis of Western and Aboriginal styles. Then in 1995, the Glenbow Museum in Calgary hosted a traveling solo exhibition curated by Leanne Martin called The Art of Alex Janvier, His First 30 Years. This month or next month, he's having a major retrospective at the National Gallery of Canada. Instead of the usual artist talk and slideshow, Janvier toured a small group of us through the exhibition. He spent over an hour and a half explaining every single painting. The biggest revelation was that many of these seemingly non-objective works were in fact maps. So this one was titled Where the Big Fish Live. In one, he pointed out where he lived relative to his kokum, where the good fishing and hunting spots were, that he invented a way to record his physical, relational, and spiritual territory in a format that can be mistaken for modernist art is a great lesson. I love the idea that his hidden knowledge has infiltrated non-Indigenous spaces, and he waits patiently for his native knowledge, the secret chamber, as Bell Hooks says, to be revealed. Janvier slowed at the end of his tour, and the group had whittled down to a handful. He spent a long time in front of his most recent paintings. They were about his experience in Indian residential school. They contained recognizable figures, buildings, and landscapes. Here he didn't want to abstract his messages. They were addressed beyond the space of irreconcilable Aboriginality. Even so, until he explained them, until he talked them into life, they remained oblique hints. It is the combination of visual art, embodied knowledge, and a gathering of engaged participants that made the experience significant, made it exceed the colonial container. The next person I want to talk to is Robert Uhl, who also went to Indian residential school. Exhibitions of Indigenous art shown within the dominant culture space are always informed by the worldviews of the managers of those spaces. Reconciliation exhibitions held in these institutions are likely to be designed within the colonial narrative, reconciliation rather than conciliation. The theory that public display of private native pain leads to individual and national healing, text over speech, etc. If display spaces are to be potential sites of conciliation, they should not meet the dominant culture viewer halfway in their space and in their way. The non-Indigenous viewer who seeks conciliation ought to enter Aboriginal sovereign display territories and feel like guests. So there are lots of examples in North America, Indian-owned spaces, and New Zealand is my favorite. I actually got to stay at this marae and do some talks there just a couple months ago. Exhibitions of Indigenous, imagine a keeping house located on reserve land, including urban reserves, that is managed by Aboriginal people and only open to Native people of that territory. That would be an irreconcilable space of Aboriginality. Now picture the same space, but open to any respectful person. That would be an Aboriginal sovereign display territory. It could also be a space of conciliation. The first gallery would be a keeping house or ceremonial space. Perhaps there would be no signs or catalogs. Your experience would be guided by knowledge keepers. Sovereign display territories might be nearly identical, but they would make concessions to visitors. The degree of inclusion would be part of what would make these spaces interesting or conciliatory. They might include visitor languages. Many items would not be available to everyone, but clever screen objects would be, so things like photographs, models, replicas, so they would have a sense of the real without violating it. I imagine that such spaces would encourage Indigenous people to make work that not only spoke to their own people, but also to visitors. It would probably value local meaning over Western notions of universal quality and blur the boundary between art and artifact. However, because it is engaged with the larger world, rather than being primarily a keeping house that preserves objects and encourages customary practices, it would also function as a cultural lab where artists would struggle creatively with the contemporary world as well as traditional forms. Some people might not want to share their experience of Indian residential schools because the sites of reconciliation administered by the TRC are temporary. Knowing that an Aboriginal sovereign display territory was permanent and includes visual and tactile objects that are activated by embodied knowledge, their makers talking about them, would encourage a slow unfolding of truths. Capital T, truth in Canada's Truth and Reconciliation, is designed not to be achieved in this vale of tears. These sites, like the Holocaust museums, have a more modest goal. Because no master narrative could contain these events, their designers elect to make room for both the facts and the many truths to find their forms and audience. There is no definitive story, no conclusion. There must be room over time for everything and everyone. You know what? I'm feeling that I'm going to be boring you. I'm going to jump a bit. So these are examples of wonderful people working with Indigenous people to make art in a real partnership rather than just trying to make work about Indigenous people. Go past Buffalo Boy. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to just add a bit. So such work should not be about Indigenous people, but a study with Indigenous people. Allies must understand the historical and embodied facts to the satisfaction of First Peoples they hope to work with. However, even before such engagements, non-Aboriginal people should first examine among themselves their motives and be able to explain their need to engage this work. So I want to talk a little bit about Ayumi Gato and Peter Morin. Government ideology and funding has created a spectacle of the Indian residential school experience as a means to distract from larger issues. This was written during the Harper time. It's much better now. The public theater of individual Indigenous people in distress is a familiar dominant culture trope designed to humiliate and contain Indigenous people. Unlike the South African Truth and Reconciliation process that counterbalanced victim presentations with scenes of individual perpetrators confessing and apologizing for their crimes, the Canadian psyche could not bear such intimate exposure and the broader implications. By focusing on Indian residential schools, the government has reduced colonialism to a soluble problem. The schools are closed, the victims are paid off, problem solved. Now shut up. Let us put the events of the past behind us so we can work towards a stronger and healthier future. And we need to challenge this narrative. We should not be in a rush to let our words imagine a reconciled, healed future. Our focus should be on creating the conditions that engender the sharing of facts in forms that cannot be easily appropriated, measured, and contained. I feel this work will be its own reward, that people will be transformed by the process. Not only will new relationships and knowledge be forged, but new works will also be produced, performances, texts, works of art that will all require decoding and resist decoding, and that in future such readings will engender further personal transformations. So art is not healing in itself, but it can be in relation. Art is a stimulant and a balm when taken internally, but dangerous if mistaken for experience. There's a profound difference between reading signs and being engaged by a symbol. Sharing in a discourse about history's responsibility and transformation among artworks and with other human beings is a corrective to the colonial desire for settlement. At the start of this essay, Aboriginal Curatorial Collective meeting and Aboriginal Advisory Circle meeting tried to picture irreconcilable spaces of Aboriginality without giving away any content. I want to signal that something interesting is going on beyond the colonial gaze. At the same time, by using the dominant cultural vernacular, I want to show what happens in these spaces to be very like what happens in similar spaces, but with different people. While the core of indigeneity is incompletely available to non-native people, those who come to spaces of conciliation not to repair Indians, but to heal themselves, who come not as colonizers, but with a conciliatory attitude to learn and share as equals, may be transformed. So I want to conclude by a bit of uplift from one of those papers I wrote for border crossings. And I hope this is helpful for artists, other artists who are non-Indigenous have thought this was useful. So I'm going to read it slow. So art is a strange supplement. It is not essential to our survival, but is integral to our humanity. It is the ornament, the flourish, the extra effort, the unpredictable addition, the unnecessary necessity. Good art is not always good design. Unrestrained by craft, art can so embellish an ordinary function as to make it useless, render a vessel, for instance, so beautiful that we feel the need to protect it from its intended service. Art is the site of intolerable research, the laboratory of odd ideas, sensual and intuitive study, and production that exceeds the boundaries of conventional disciplines, protocols, and imaginaries. Art is a display of surplus, of skill, ingenuity, knowledge, discipline, time, labor, and wealth. Art embroiders status, disguises corruption, and celebrates power. But art is also the stage where other surplus finds expression, It can be a way for the marginalized, refused, and repressed to return. Few are immune to what beauty stirs in us. Beautiful nature stimulates a pleasure that defies reason and seems to embody timeless being apart from ideology. In some, it evokes the spiritual. Even materialists are arrested by nature. While they do not look for metaphysical authorship, they too are awed by the order, complexity, and beauty of natural processes that exist independent of human hands and consciousness. Formal excellence in art is similarly inspiring. Many find in human-made things the expression of creative perfection, of a genius so wonderful, complete, and novel that they feel compelled to ascribe its power to a source beyond the human. Others see in beautiful works of art evidence of humanness freed from the grasp of conventionalizing power of a momentary regime. In the making and appreciation of art, there is a space of difference, even resistance, where people can find refuge from the ideas that otherwise rule them. The feelings produced by the beautiful are extra-rational, non-instrumental, and overwhelming. Beautiful art is non-propositional. Such objects do not make logical claims that can be tested for truth value. They show, they embody, they simply are. People preoccupied by a utilitarian worldview, who are possessed by the attitude that sees real value only in an object or person's use, can find beauty disturbing. Beauty is subversive insofar as it makes us aware that there is more to life than utility, reason, and pragmatism. Beautiful human-made things are passionate evidence that people desire and perform at least part of their lives in excess of the instrumental. So that's happy. And I'm done.